Hi, George Alger here with True Green Energy, and I'm speaking with Craig Shields, the author of Renewable Energy, Facts and Fantasies. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks very much, George.
Craig, there are a lot of subjects covered in this book as you spoke to 25 experts, but I wanted to touch bases on national security as it relates to renewable energy. What can you tell us?
Well, I can tell you my own opinion based on the conversations that I've had with a great number of people, and then I'll get into one in specific. I think that that if you're the parents of a young man or woman who's on the verge of being a part of our military, you have reason to be concerned that the thing for which you're fighting ultimately has to do somewhere, somehow with our energy policy and our dependence on foreign oil. There are those who debate that, but there aren't many. Even the people, the most kind of open-minded, best-studied people in this thing, and James Woolsey, the ex-CIA director, I certainly think of as one of them. He's my interview for the second chapter there on national defense and that type of thing. His concern is, quoting a great number of the authors he's read and a lot of the studies that he's done, that the governments of the 180 plus sovereign nations of this world tend to be worse, whose economic rents, as it were, are derived from a single commodity. A lot of if you take the 20 or 30 most suppressive governments on this planet, most of them are rooted in the revenues that derive from oil or from some other single commodity. Thomas L. Friedman refers to this effect as "fill her up with dictators." So my point is that if you favor democracy, if you favor human rights that ultimately democracy in its finest form can bring, you certainly favor a dissolution of our dependence on foreign oil.
All right, well, let's look at the future of renewable energy and how it would relate to not only national security for the United States, but really for other countries in general. I mean, is it going to engender chaos into the playing field as the power shifts around, or actually will it end up with a more neutral and friendly environment?
You know, it's hard to say what's going to happen in this world. Insofar as what you have, obviously, the reason we're still pumping furiously oil out of the ground is because there's so much money and power associated with this. Nobody, except for the people who benefit directly from that process, that practice, think that's a good idea. But there's so much money and power rooted in it that this is the way the world works. So the question, I mean, you ask a very good question, albeit unanswerable, and that is, where is this going? And the answer is, I don't honestly know. I do think that whether national security is the reason to get you off of oil, or whether it's the fact that we're still borrowing $1 billion a day, further indebting ourselves, pumping that wealth offshore, whether your concern is global warming or peak oil or the social chaos associated with all this, I mean, there are a great number of different completely independent reasons to want to get away from our dependence on oil. Take your pick. And where is this going? I don't know. I mean, that's what gets me out of bed every morning, is that I'm anxious to tell this story to as many people who will listen. So that's the book.
Well, even on that one point, $1 billion a day, I mean, that seems so absurd that I'm left questioning, how could someone defend that? So there's another point in this argument, and yet I can't imagine it.
Well, I mean, I don't want to sound cynical or like a conspiracy theorist, or that I only see the worst in people and the trajectory of humanity. Having said that, I don't know how to answer that except to say that we are doing that. These are indisputed facts, and you've got an industry that is so whose power is so ubiquitous worldwide, and certainly in the United States. I mean, the oil companies employ 7,000 lobbyists. This is by far the biggest lobbying community in the known universe. So, I mean, even if you don't impute direct corruption to the effect of those lobbyists, which I do, but I mean, corporate lobbying is legal, for better or for worse. So you have to think they're buying something. They're smart people. They're not just having 7,000 people traipse around the Beltway just for, just to add more traffic to the 495.
So I'm left with the idea here that, in fact, there is a renewable energy, that not only is there a need for renewable energy in terms of national defense, but that in the basis of this conversation right here, or as a result of this conversation, I'm left thinking, wow, that what the direction that we're going in has no win. I mean, it's just a downward. It seems like it's a path to destruction.
It is, which makes me, and again, I don't want to sound like holier than thou or that my whole concern is humanitarian, though I try to approach this from a philosophic standpoint. I am curious to know what's in it for people who are enriching themselves in the short period of time they're going to be here on this planet, at the expense of doing what's obviously right versus wrong. I just don't understand it. I'm a guy who, who likes money and flying first class and so forth and so on, but I don't like it to the extent that I would do something that's destroying the welfare of the 7 billion people who are here now, not to mention future generations. I just simply don't understand it. Again, I know that may sound, holier than thou, and I apologize for that.
Okay, so what might be some solutions here?
Well, I think we're going in the right direction. I think, and even the oil companies are quickly becoming natural gas companies. So in other words, they've seen the writing on the wall with respect to a certain, natural gas, by the way, is less toxic for the environment. It is less, it creates less carbon emissions in terms of global climate change. It's still, it's not a long-term solution, but it's where a lot of people are going. Energy companies are going to make another buck for another few decades as we evolve to clean energy, and we will get there. The interesting part about this thing to me is that, and I've had this discussion numerous times at this very table, are we going to be driving Hummers 100 years from now? Of course not. Are we, all of this stuff is going to change. The only real question is exactly when, in favor of exactly what, exactly why. In other words, what about the kind of supply and demand curves for oil and natural gas and photovoltaics and wind and so forth? All of this is dynamic. All of this is creating an environment where nobody knows exactly when we're going to have grid parity. In other words, the time at which renewables reach the point of an equivalence in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. So if you ask me, I can tell you when I think it's going to be based on what I've read, but I'm only as good as what I've read. And, that's pretty much, I think, the fate facing any of us. There's a lot to learn here. There are tough realities. This stuff is changing every week. You read new things, new discoveries that are changing the calculus here, not only in terms of the technology, but also in terms of the economics and the politics. So we have the midterm elections that changed the constituency of the Congress, and thus had enormous consequences in terms of what do we look like in terms of a federal renewable portfolio standard for the rest of the Obama administration in the foreseeable future? Well, it didn't look good before, and it looks even worse now. So, a whole bunch of I'm sure there are going to be a whole bunch of books written on the subject, and there's a lot to keep track of.
Okay, so is there any elements in government that are vocal about the fact that we need to make changes in this direction now because of national security, let alone all the other reasons?
Sure. Well, James Woolsey is a guy who was, as I mentioned, CIA director for 3 or 4 years in the middle part of the last decade under the George W. Bush administration. And he's a very well-regarded, extremely intelligent guy, very well-connected. Obviously, he's got people who trust his reasoning in both the Senate and the House. Exactly who these players are at any one time, I couldn't tell you. And of course, you have federal issues, but the federal, I'm a little sympathetic to the thing with the federal. If I were the Secretary of Energy or any prominent figure on this thing, exactly what I do on this thing it's a tough game to play where you have 50 different states, you have 50 different renewable resources. I mean, you have tidal, obviously, next to the, around the oceans. You've got run-of-river hydro in the east. You've got wind blowing in the plains. You've got, sun shining in the deserts. You got geothermal in the mountains. You've got, but what do you have in Georgia? Well, you don't have as much in Georgia as you have in Wyoming. So how are you going to deal with that at a federal level? I grant that it's a tricky thing to do. But I think what I'm saying is we need to be supportive of this generally, instead of finding reasons why not to do it and how to continue to rubber stamp the initiatives of the oil companies. We need to find a way to say no. In other words, what almost happened here in California in November was the passing of Prop 23, which would have completely eviscerated every iota of work we've done in creating the state of California as a kind of leader in clean energy. And it didn't come microscopically close to passing, but it got 46% of the popular vote based on the fact that it was funded by two enormous oil companies who spent tens of millions of dollars lying to and convincing tens of millions of voters on this subject. So that's scary, the fact that people are not paying attention to this to the degree that you can have 45% of a popular vote go for something that favors two oil companies at the expense of, tens of millions of Californians, and not to mention the fact that the types of things that happen in California tend to have repercussions around the world. I love this woman arguing for Prop 23 who said, the reason not to do this, guys, is that only 3% of greenhouse gases are emitted in the state of California worldwide. In other words, only 3%. 97% come from the rest of the 49 states and the rest of the world. So there's no reason for you guys to do anything extraordinary here. Well, fortunately, she was talking to some people who noticed that we're not just anybody here. I'm not trying to sound obnoxious about this, but California has a kind of a track record of doing things that set a standard of leadership for progressive ideas and things that actually do make a difference around the world. So fortunately, they lost, but my point is, anything can happen on this thing, and it's a hotly contested political environment.
All right, you are very well read. You have a lot of contacts in this area. You do have your own viewpoints. As of right now, where do you see a significant change or an important change occurring in the landscape of renewable energy?
Well, I guess the thing about which I'm most excited, I'm trying to think of where exactly to start. I guess I would go back to this thing about grid parity. And that is, over the years that I've been studying this thing, you hear about the global warming hoax. You hear that there are people who don't believe, the global warming deniers who believe that the selfish interests of the scientists who have accepted money in exchange for to do atmospheric research, that supposedly creates an environment where they change the figures to support more money for global climate change study. Now, personally, I don't believe that simply because I know a lot of these people, and the whole notion is absurd. I also point out that if you want a financial incentive to stack the deck in favor or against renewable energy, I think there's a little bit more money being spent extracting and distilling and selling trillions of gallons of gasoline than there is in studying the effects of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So if you're looking for a motive, you don't have to look too far to find one. Having said that, all of this stuff is going to change very quickly, and that will happen when the cost of renewables continues to come down. It's getting to the point where in another few years it will have crossed the line in terms of an incremental megawatt generator. It'll be less expensive to do this in photovoltaics than it'll be doing to do it in coal. Why? And that's going to make a hell of a short conversation in the great energy boardrooms around the world, where all of a sudden it's actually cheaper to do this thing in a renewable way. Not only do you not have the kind of consequence to your own conscience in terms of what you're doing to the planet, but you're actually saving yourself and your shareholders money. It's going to be it's going to be over real quick. So my point is, I guess that's what your question was, what gets me most excited, where do I think the trajectory for success lies, and that's it, the application of what's generally referred to as Moore's Law. In other words, there was a guy, Gordon Moore, the guy who, one of the founders of Intel, who noticed that the number of transistors you could put on an integrated circuit was doubling every 2 years. So, and applied to a great number of other things. Here, the cost of doing this, as the cost of technology is falling, thus we're going to be in a position in the not too distant future where this is the bargain of the century.
Very good. All right, Craig, that's it for this segment. Thank
All right.
you very much.
Bet.
This is George Alger with Two Green Energy, talking with Craig Shields, the author of Renewable Energy, Facts and Fantasies.